There's all these protesters who are coming here. You know, aren't there thousands of people coming here to disrupt things in this city? And I'd say, oh yeah. I mean, there's thousands of people, and they're planning tremendous disruptions. They're going to shut down the entire downtown. They're going to block it off to traffic. They're going to put up big fences with barbed wire and keep people out of a large section of downtown. And when the presidential motorcade comes in, the airport's going to be shut down. The freeways are going to be shut down. They're planning huge disruption in our city. And I go, oh, you were talking about the protesters. Oh, yeah, they might be planning some disruption too.
Drop the charges! The fire and the power, you know?
Hi, I'm Mike Duncan, Chairman of the Republican National Committee. This September 1st, our party will come together for the most exciting political event of the summer, the Republican National Convention in Minneapolis, St. Paul. People from all across the country will be coming to the party. We want you to join us too.
We're the ones who organize the buses for people to ride 22 hours to get out there. And, you know, the other people do all the logistics of housing us and figuring out where we march and all that kind of stuff. And here we were. Now we were going to be the host city, just as I guess the Republicans themselves, you know, do all the preparation as the host city and spend 2 years doing that. So do the protesters in that sense, because it was going to be clearly a time to show what people think about, you know, the Republican agenda and the war agenda in general, whether it's the Republicans or not.
I was involved in a few different projects. The biggest one was the citywide student walkout against the war, against cuts in education, against the Republican agenda in general. It took place on the fourth day of the RNC.
A multiracial group of poor people come together from around the country to say no to homelessness and poverty.
The premise of the Minnesota Peace Team were to be advocates for nonviolence in that Republican National Convention and the events happening around that, and to be advocates for no single partisan position.
And so Kat and myself and Celia and Michelle were part of that original group that actually worked on the North Star Healthcare Collective and started organizing what we ended up calling the Eggplant, which was the clinic. Which helped treat some of the obviously countless victims of police thuggery in St. Paul and Minneapolis.
This is what democracy looks like.
It's been weeks since this historic showdown between protesters and police during the RNC, and the clashes continue.
I was very sad and disappointed for our city.
It was a dangerous day. It was not about free speech for these 500, it was about criminal action.
And perception, how the city handled those determined to crash the convention. Also in the audience here tonight, Tom Heffelfinger and Andy Luger. They are two former federal prosecutors who are in charge of the official inquiry into what happened during the week of the RNC.
We were retained by you as a commission to, pursuant to a scope of work, to focus on the planning, implementation, and execution of a law enforcement plan for the Republican National Convention, the RNC.
So one of the things that we did is spend a lot of time figuring out, was there a real threat from this group, the RNC Welcoming Committee, to shut down the convention, harm people, and hurt property.
I've been organizing with the Welcoming Committee for the last 2 years, and I am, in fact, an anarchist. I believe that government is organized crime. I want to see a world of anarchy without domination, without thugs, without warlords, without tyrants, and without politicians.
I want to pick up on what Celia said about there are no terrorists up here. There are no terrorists in the Ramsey County Jail. There are terrorists in the Excel Center, there are terrorists in the White House. So when the people who are directly responsible for these acts of abuses of power come to the Twin Cities, to my hometown of St. Paul, I need to speak up. I owe it to my friends in other countries. I owe it to the people of New Orleans. I owe it to Native Americans. I owe it to everyone. And that's what I've done.
The welcoming committee basically saw itself as a organizational body for the logistical support of getting people like housing and food, and sort of like creating some of that infrastructure to help other people succeed in whatever like their protest visions were.
The only strategy that we had was an organizing model. It wasn't like, from the start we were an organizing body that operated upon like these anarchist principles of unity. Basically, we were non-hierarchical, everything was, we were consensus driven. But as far as strategy goes, I think one thing that we stressed was that we were going to work with lots of different groups with different politics from ours, and I was really excited about that. We had meetings with the coalition to march on the RNC and stop the war, and the anti-war committee, and lots of different groups, and we tried to make sure that all the protests, all the different groups protesting were kind of working together, and so they wouldn't step on each other's toes. And we came up with the St. Paul principles, which were kind of agreed upon principles of how we would interact with each other, with police. And so, as far as that goes, I think our organizing was really successful. But we still were in communication with the march organizers that, you know, typically this is how radicals or anarchists respond to conventions, and this is what's going to happen, and this is what might happen. And they were understanding, and they knew stuff was going to happen. Everyone knew that people were going to break the law. The police obviously knew that people were going to break the law. They counted on it. They spent money counting on it. And now afterwards, everyone's saying like, "Oh, those anarchists! That was such a surprise and so shocking." But none of the protest organizers were surprised. It's just kind of like this mainstream media like uproar about it. As far as like the violent plans that might have happened or taken place at the RNC, we had nothing to do with any of that. Yeah. I mean, we never told people, come with your Molotov cocktails, obviously. People chose the extent to which they were going to participate on their own, and I think we all agreed that we're not going to set guidelines for anyone. We didn't set any guidelines that people couldn't march with the protest. We said people should do whatever they feel is, how they want to protest. And so we're really explicit that no one should denounce other people's actions.
We're just not interested in policing each other in our movement.
There's already police to do that for us.
Yeah.
My name's Garrett. I'm one of the RNC 8. We're organizers who are facing charges with terrorism enhancements for our work around the Republican National Convention.
They're charged initially with conspiracy to riot in support of terrorism. And that sounds awful, but of course it doesn't fit. And since that time, they've also charged them with other configurations of just riot or just conspiracy or doing it without terrorism, but they chose to come down as hard as they could. That's as hard as they could.
It's ridiculous. I mean, who are the RNC 8? They're a bunch of hippies. Really, when it boils down to it, these are people that recycle water, they feed the poor. So one of the great problems with the RNC is it's all been conflated together. I mean, you have this the two guys from Texas and the one from Michigan with Molotovs, and that's somehow all part of the RNC8 thing. These guys were going to blow up the Excel Center. That's one of the lines that you keep seeing in the media. They were going to throw Molotovs at police, and it was a completely separate deal, you know.
We saw Fox 9 embedded with the police department. They weren't reporting on, 6-year-old little, or 3-year-old little children in strollers doing anti-poverty chants, or talking about what it's like to be homeless kids in this country. We found out that the welcoming committee had made a decision to close down the Twin Cities. And so we really had to think about the ramifications of having an absolute media blackout of issues of homelessness and hunger and poverty in this country.
Right. So you have this demonstration of 10,000 people, and then 20 go and break stuff, and it becomes all about them.
Police lost control of the anarchists during the Republican National Convention.
The anarchists who left a trail of vandalism in their wake without cause or ideology.
For the conduct of 500 to 600 anarchists.
Downtown belonged to the anarchists.
These are not civil protesters.
It's a much different situation than here, where folks are celebrating America.
Say what you want about the anarchists, and tonight you can say an awful lot about
anarchists.
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 Anarchists. Anarchists.
The anarchist element that hit this city on the 1st of September was organized. It had sophisticated communication means, and it operated with the specific intent of coordinated attack on the people of St. Paul and its property.
Threat of what the anarchists were doing overhyped? I don't think so. I mean, I think there's a legitimate concern there, and when people get out and express themselves on the internet as to what they might do, you have to take those types of possible incidents of property damage or violence seriously. You can't discount them. I think to do so would be irresponsible and would put people at risk, and you don't want that.
We watched videotape, countless hours of videotape, showing on the left, on the top left, you see breaking a business window. On the top right, you see people smashing the windows of a police car. On the bottom left, people are assaulting someone who tried to stop the violent anarchists from breaking windows. And then on videotape, you can actually hear people in the crowd who are watching this event call out, "Don't kill him." And then finally on the bottom right, and we're going to get into this in more detail, perhaps the most frightening moment of this convention is when violent anarchists are throwing materials over the Marion Street Bridge onto traffic coming on I-94. And as we'll show, actually struck a bus of delegates coming to the convention from Washington State. We draw a very clear distinction between those who came to St. Paul to commit violence versus those who came to St. Paul to get their voices heard in a peaceful manner. And we define the first in the report by the self-proclaimed title of anarchists and the second as protesters.
Yeah, I don't think anarchism is necessarily violent at all. I think what anarchism is about is, people having direct control over their own lives, decisions being made by those most affected by their outcome, and so anarchism means that we don't need to elect officials to make our decisions for us, that we're actually fully capable of understanding the circumstances around our own lives and making those decisions ourselves.
They were using a very selective definition, and that for me was like, when I saw that on page 2, it's like, oh, you guys have had to define what an anarchist is. You've had to ignore like 10 other subtleties of definition have appeared before your eyes. Violent anarchists, violent anarchists, violent anarchists, and I'm just like, okay, like he was using the phrase where it was just like, okay, you're making a huge point about using this phrase repeatedly. I mean, this wasn't exactly, a riot, not by any normal definition. Yeah, there was a couple of people doing stuff, but, Macy's window was broken the week before the RNC by some drunken person. It gets broken every 2 weeks. Can we keep this in perspective? They broke a couple of windows. We can survive that. Our democracy can survive that. We do not need to fill our streets with riot police because of 20 or 30 people who actually, dragged stuff into the road and what have you.
First of all, the law enforcement response to the anarchist violence during the RNC was generally professional and restrained.
This is Democracy Now! Breaking with Convention War Peace and the presidency, from the suites to the streets to the convention floor. As Senator John McCain accepted the Republican presidential nomination inside the Excel Center last night, nearly 400 people were being arrested on the streets of St. Paul, bringing the total number of convention-related arrests to more than 800. On Thursday afternoon, several hundred anti-war protesters had rallied at the state capitol about 5 p.m. when their protest permit expired. They tried to march to the convention center. But in one of the largest shows of police force during the Republican convention, hundreds of riot police arrived on the scene backed by snow plows, horses, and dump trucks to seal off downtown from the demonstrators. The protesters continued walking, tried to cross several bridges that span Interstate 94 into downtown St. Paul. As night fell, police turned to harsher tactics. They fired concussion grenades, smoke bombs, pepper spray into the crowd. The march ended with more than 200 demonstrators trapped on the Marion Street Bridge, with hundreds of police and riot gear blocking either side. The protesters were forced to sit on the tarmac with their hands on their heads. The police then moved in and arrested everybody, including more than a dozen members of the media.
Anything I've seen, and I've been involved in demonstrations for 40 years, and I have not seen that level of repression on the streets, that absolute total crackdown on people. I've seen a few instances of brutality that have been worse than what I saw there. But the overall preemptive strike against protesters was worse than I've ever seen.
For those of us who were there on the ground, let me tell you exactly what really happened. The police invariably opened fire on innocent protesters, sometimes as they were chanting, "This is a peaceful protest." And I saw this happening over and over and over and over again.
With the flashbangs, you can see burns. With capsicum rounds, you'll see like a chemical burn. It's like capsicum is like a pepper oil. It burns you, it sticks. Plastic bullets, rubber bullets, wooden bullets, those are all impact sorts of things, but those can ricochet and splinter. So you can see like embedded wooden splinters. You can see, injuries like plain old giant bruises with underlying issues. I mean, people get shot in the back, you can get shot in the kidneys and you pee blood. I mean, they're not just skin bruises. I mean, so you're talking about like trauma to your kidneys, trauma to your liver, trauma to your spleen.
Mick Kelly is with the anti-war committee, and he's holding a banner. A cop comes along, tries to rip the banner out of his hand. He holds on to it. When he does that, another cop steps forward. He's not resisting. He's just holding on to his banner that a cop is trying to rip away from him. Shoots Mick Kelly right in the gut, and you see that he's got this huge bruise. Huge bruise.
And I looked back and I saw this young man leaning against the building, hands behind him, with just his eyes blank. And that could be from fear, it could be from intimidation, it could be from any number of things. But there was a cafe across the street where a bunch of people were sitting outside, and they had watched what had occurred, and they said that this young man had a backpack. And the police, many of them, approached him and said they wanted to see what was in his backpack. And he evidently refused. It was routine, we later learned, for them to stop anyone who had a backpack. They tasered him several times, according to the police, to the pedestrians outside the cafe. And he was screaming, bawling. They dragged him back onto the concrete, and they pummeled him kicked his head, pummeled him. That totally changed the light of the whole event for me. I had expected that we really might be able to help, that we would have at least police cooperation because they pretty much knew about us. But at that point, I didn't trust anyone. And I remember thinking as I looked at these rows of police later, I must be in a different country. This is not my country.
When Amy Goodman was arrested, I'm sure you may have talked to other people who were there. There's a whole bunch of people that were pepper sprayed at point blank and were just sitting there like in the zip cuffs, like covered in pepper spray, screaming because they were burning. And there's a whole bunch of medics standing outside, like right by that freaking gas station, right at the end of St. Paul there by Sibley. And just like, can we treat, you know? And there's no one was allowed in or out, and people just sat there like burning.
And I heard somebody say, "Medic, we need a medic over here." So I ran over, and it turns out that the cops had maced this 70-year-old guy who was part of the Minnesota Peace Team. These people have been working with the cops to set them up in front and get in between the cops and the crowd in case there was confrontations. There's one, I know this guy, very, very sweet guy. And the cops maced, I mean, they came out and maced him in the face as an obvious attempt to try and provoke a reaction and give them the more excuses to have more brutality. And so I'm treating this guy, and while I'm treating this guy, I heard somebody come up to me from the crowd, ran to me and says, "Hey guy, get out of here." I just heard the cops say, "Get the medic in blue." The cops were targeting medics. They were targeting medics, and they've never done that before.
And this was a rarity. I haven't seen it. Well,
right.
I shouldn't
Not
speak.
as much.
I shouldn't speak too widely there, but it seemed like a lot of people reacted with surprise to the fact that a lot of medics got arrested, marked medics. In past protests, again, not too broadly, there's been more respect shown to the idea that medics are neutral, that they are not part of the protesters. Medics have been obviously, when the police want to target the infrastructure of a protest, if you're wearing a giant symbol, it's easy to pick you out of the crowd.
They're refining their strategy and intensifying their strategy. A lot of it is in ways which we don't see directly. The national direction, the involvement of the military. I mean, they had the Coast Guard with machine guns pointed at, at the shores of the river there in downtown St. Paul, where people were holding like a concert.
Demonstrations are marching out of the city, and the police had lined up on the exit road stopping people. They couldn't come any further, and the people marching stopped in the middle of a bridge and went through a whole series of things, but we all had hopes that they would be exiting. And I was standing right next to the line of police with the batons and the ninja suits, 20 strong, ready for that confrontation, and talked with the commander. And it was, again, one of our leaders, and this time Catherine Wilchum got involved, and we just said the question, how are people going to get off the bridge? We don't know. What would be the best exit for them? Straight up the street. You are blocking the street. Yes, I know. I'm trying to reach my commander, says the commander, but our radios aren't working. We don't have good connection. We can't get through. Would you like to borrow my cell phone? Says Catherine.
Fun story is I go to my son and say, "Hey, you know what? You want to run with your old man as a street medic?" So he said, "Yeah, let's go." So we go to Minneapolis, and the cops sprayed this kid that was walking by that wasn't doing anything. Turns out the kid was an Iraqi vet. Had just gotten back from Iraq.
Oh man!
And the cops sprayed him. So then, I start treating the kid. So while I'm treating this kid, all of a sudden the cops lines open up. There's a big old armored car, kind of like the Saracen type of deal.
There's a lot of pictures of it. Yeah.
Cop actually points his baton run at me and says, "Yeah, get him." I'm like, "Oh shit!" So I "Okay, Sean, come on, let's go, get out of here, PDQ." And we start walking away. And as we're walking away, Big old line of cops come out, they surround me, push my son off the side. My son goes, I'm going to go get that lawyer guy to go get help. And they did that. They actually surrounded and said, you know what, you stay there or else we will tase you. I thank God I never heard that.
They were not wearing their badges. There was no way of identifying who these individuals were behind rubber costumes or metal masks. So if something happened, who do you go after?
City council meeting on the RNC where the local former district attorney is giving his full report, and they talked about this, that, and the other, and there was no mention of the fact that there are verifiable reports that the cops were torturing people inside the Ramsey County Jail. They were actually torturing people.
Elliot Hughes.
Elliot Hughes.
I'm here to relate to you my brutal experiences at the hands of the Ramsey County Sheriff's Office. During my detention, I was forced a number of times to go without food for many hours, to a point where I fainted and I was coughing up blood. A number of us chanted for food, and I was singled out by about a dozen guards who came into my cell, and one of which punched me in the face, right in the temple, knocking me unconscious. My head was then grabbed and smashed against the concrete floor, as you see in this bruise right here. If I hadn't mentioned yet, I'm 19 years old. I came back to consciousness in a pool of my own blood, and I was dragged away. I was taken into a hallway where a bag was put over my head, and it had a gag in the mouth. And I was taken into a detaining cell with no visible cameras. And officers then twisted my ankles and used pressure point tactics to torture me. They pressed right behind your ear, behind my ears. If you demonstrate that on yourself, you can feel with only a few pounds of pressure, it hurts like no other pain I've ever felt in my life. And I was screaming, crying, begging God for mercy.
I was there when he came out of the jail.
Yeah.
And, I mean, like, I'd been there.
You called me that time.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah.
Like, flipping my shit. I'm like, I'm standing, like, on a grassy boulevard. Like, I need a hospital room. Like, I need people to come and, like, save this situation. Yeah. I've been standing there all day, and, like, people are coming out, like, oh, you know, a horse stood on my finger, and, like, it's all messed up. But, I mean, like, my finger is messed up, right? Yeah. And, I mean, like, person after person, you know, they would need, you know, some rescue remedy, they need bus fare, they need directions, they're like, I don't even know where I am right now. And then all of a sudden, these two boys come out, and, like, they are mauled. I mean, just, like, this kid had stitches. Yeah. Like, he'd gotten hurt in jail, they took him to Regents, they stitched him up, they brought him back to jail. Yeah. And, I mean, like, their pants had been cut with trauma shears. Like, one kid didn't even have a shirt. I mean, one kid didn't even have shoes. It was ridiculous. And I mean, and so so what happened was these two boys came out, and Elliot Hughes, and I'm not going to remember the second boy's name, but and I was like, well, first things first, like, you need privacy and dignity. And so there were medics that held blankets up, and I just remember talking to them, and they were like, well, you know, we haven't eaten, we haven't you know, talked to our families, we haven't anything. And I mean, like, Elliot still had dried blood on his face and, you know, bruises all over his body. He was like, this is where they held me. You know, you could see the fingerprints on his arms and legs.
And they did it for 2 hours. They did it for 2 hours.
Hours.
Of these kids screaming. Yeah.
And so I was sitting there, and I was like, well, you know, I can clean you up. Like, we can sort of wash you a little bit, but, like, this is not going to address the underlying issue that you probably have trauma going on in your body.
I think the purpose of the report that was commissioned by the City of St. Paul was basically to provide a scrutiny of the law enforcement activities in which the City of St. Paul may have been involved. I think that they pay some attention to that and really don't go into the background of the people who are demonstrating and protesting or were involved in trying to speak. And I think in shortchanging it, they just assume that they did what law enforcement claims that they did. And I think they did a disservice in making a report of that nature.
I came on the bus today from Minneapolis, and I went through that, and I was like with Peter, and I'm saying, oh yeah, this is the Marion Street Bridge, you know, where the mass arrest on day 4 of the RNC took place. Oh yeah, this is where the Capitol, you know, where they told the gathering to disperse. Oh, we're on Cedar and 12th now. This is where a bunch of people were arrested, and it was like, and it's like all these landmarks are now associated with this awful, awful government overkill.
One of the issues that we heard of great concern from members of the community was the allegation of mass arrest on September 1st down in the park at the foot of Chestnut along the river, and an allegation of mass arrest up on the Marion Street Bridge on the evening of September 4th. I had this map brought in here because I think it's important to recognize. The events of September 4th started when the permitted group, which was called the Anti-War Committee, very visibly and publicly announced they were not going to comply with their permit, and as they told a police officer, we're not going to march when you tell us to. At 5 o'clock, the police made the decision that if they haven't marched by the end of their permit, we're going to close off access to downtown. At 5 o'clock, the police announced to the crowd that the permit was canceled because the permit had ended. The police blocked off all of the bridges into downtown St. Paul from Jackson all the way up to John Ireland, and blocked it off with a combination of manpower and heavy equipment like snowplows. Down Marion, they use bullhorns, their own physical presence, and smoke grenades and flashbang devices to drive the assembled crowd, which turned out to be about 350 people, down through the parking lot and onto the Marion Street Bridge. And then you will see the final arrest. As a commission, we are very concerned about this incident. We recognize that the police response was driven by some very difficult considerations. However, we think the events on the Marion Street Bridge warrant further review by appropriate authority, as it bears some of the indicators of a mass arrest that would warrant that further inquiry.
Eventually, they herded, hundreds of people onto the bridge. I was the first one. But I couldn't really see anything by then because, like the smoke and the, it's tear gas, there was just this haze. I couldn't really see anything. So, but I heard a megaphone saying, if you're on the bridge, you're under arrest, get down, get down on the ground, put your hands on your head and everything. Probably still had my hands on my head, but I was like, I'm press, I have a badge in my pocket, we don't care at all. So, you're being charged with unlawful assembly and refusal to leave and failure to obey a lawful order. And this was, by the way, they originally wrote those down on the bridge, and somebody told my arresting officer, we're putting down 2 charges for everybody over here. So they just wrote down the same 2 charges for everybody in that part of the bridge.
Well, the report seems to judge law enforcement activities on a basis of what a perceived threat might be, even if the perceived threat did not materialize. I don't think it properly considers the effect of ratcheting up the tension that law enforcement units that are on the street, that are have a group with motorcycles, a group by horseback, a group in armor, a group that's dressed to look like Darth Vader, has in walking the streets. I think that was unnecessary and basically contributed to the tension that was felt.
First Amendment of the Constitution says that we have the legal right as citizens to peaceably assemble. It doesn't say peaceably assemble inside of a cage. See video footage of like the free speech zone, yes, where there's like one guy on the microphone on the stage and there's two people in the crowd. And dissent is steadily and continually being even more violently suppressed virtually every year now.
On the first 3 days of classes, we had a big enough team of volunteers getting up bright and early in the morning that on the first 2 days of classes we hit every St. Paul's school twice and most of Minneapolis schools twice with thousands of leaflets. We had a couple people arrested in the process, etc. And I think we were actually very effective at getting the word out, so much so that on the second day of classes, the day before our walkout, September 3rd, the St. Paul police chief had a press conference, and among other things, he sent a message out. He says, you know, one of the things we are most worried about is students leaving class tomorrow and going on the streets of St. Paul, which we warn them is going to be very dangerous. And obvious, you know, the implication from the police officers is, well, you know, it's these crazy protesters that are going to create these melee, but you know, we interpret that, I think, in what it was a veiled threat that, you know, students go onto the streets, they could, you know, risk getting beat and arrested by the police. We'd already, we had a permitted protest. We'd negotiated with the other groups who were planning actions that day to make sure we had proper separation of time and space. So we were confident, you know, unless the police broke their word with us, that we were going to have a safe event. But, you know, how do you communicate that to thousands of students who've received your leaflet other than, you know, we did our best. But they also, the students, the school districts organized phone calls home to at least several schools, Central High, Highland Park, and we had reports from other schools. They had letters home sent out most of the students. So there was quite a fear-mongering campaign with the media whipping up, you know, these images of violence and, you know, police aggression and riot cops lining things, and the whole atmosphere being, you know, pretty scary. You know, it was only the more politically conscious, confident youth that came out. So we only had about 400 probably at our demonstration, where we were expecting maybe, you know, 1,000-2,000.
It was very weird for me because I've lived in the Middle East, and where someone says, hey, I'll see you in an hour or whatever, and then they never turn up, and you find out a day later they've been arrested. And it was that kind of feeling in Minnesota, in St. Paul, Minnesota, you know. People were scared, and they had a good reason to be. I mean,
that they are stepping up the repression. I think it's a feeling that they want to make sure that nobody can even think about challenging the government on these kinds of things. And I think that's really it. And certainly when we get to talk about the RNC 8, there you're talking about thought crimes. It's about, you know, it's now illegal to think about doing anything that would be effective to challenge or change the policies of the government. Comes that thing, the good protester versus the bad protester. If you stand down by the river with your candlelight vigils and sing Kumbaya, it's okay. But if you think about doing anything more than that, you're going to be met by this line of riot cops. And, you know, it's an intimidation.
I was raised, like I say, in Northern Ireland. I lived in Northern Ireland from 1969 until 1994. I have actually watched the police state come in, and we use the terms police state, not as a chant in a crowd, but as an actual reality. I have witnessed a police state come into existence, and I'm watching all those indicators of finding place in this country right here now.
Before there was a big crowd, we would talk to them just like you would any other day of the week. They're just our neighbors. They're our friends. most of the time, I had, one of the stories a friend told was that they were in the Peace March on Sunday when there were 15,000 people, and they had come around the corner and there was this big phalanx of, people in the black, the police in their black outfits and the rest of that. And they said, wow, that's really impressive. And then on the return trip, everything had gone peaceful, everything was dispersing, and in the middle of this, the one fellow took off his helmet, and my friend said, oh, it's Billy! Hi, Billy! Because Billy's a neighbor, Billy grew up on their block. He played with their kids. I mean, that's who these people were behind the mask, but you couldn't, it was just, it seemed unnecessary.
A lot of people were brought in for the RNC. I mean, we talked briefly about how many people we saw from out of town, but, I was seeing squad cars from all over the country. I mean, literally, Tucson Police Department parked on the street in St. Paul. And Des Moines, we were violent anarchists, full of, Molotov cocktails in our back pockets or whatever. And seeing, whatever it was that they were seeing from us, I think the overreaction was predestined. I don't know. It's they were told to act they were primed psychologically to act in a certain way. I mean, if a small town cop is told, you're going to get hired X number of dollars a day to come to Minneapolis and save Minneapolis from
the raging anarchist hordes.
Yeah, the evil people from down under, and you're going to react in that way. All this money went into sort of planning for major chaos. And when it didn't come to fruition, I feel like they wanted a chance to use their toys.
As the week went on, I was able to talk with people who were themselves policemen and or part of the police families. What I heard were the following: that for the month before the RNC, every day, the St. Paul Police and the Sheriff's Department were getting all sorts of information bulletins and calls in, and people saying, basically, fanning the flames of fear and anxiety. I had one friend tell me that she had a neighbor who was a uniformed officer who worked in the evidence room, had been had some physical illness and could, for several years now, has not been on the streets, and maintains evidence inside the police building, surrounded by hundreds of people. And she was weeping almost every day. She was so anxious and upset about what was going to happen. The evidence room? No. No, not relative to opposition to Republican administration. Zero for me. And if anything, I think it reinforced people on the right. They didn't get as reinforced as they wanted to. What it was clear to me, the one benefit was, I think, people who are opposed to governmental policies or anti-war, wishing to any war demonstrations, will be able to act smarter. I would hope act smarter in the future. This was, as an anti-war demonstration, an anti-administration demonstration, I think it was outrageously unsuccessful.
One thing that I found was the greatest lesson that I got from this is that with the hype and all of the, the fear-mongering that went on, day 4, people still showed up.
Oh, yeah.
There were people still showed up and says, no, we are going to march.
In a pattern that's going on throughout the country, and it's part of a much larger thing than just our RNC. A situation in this country where there's always factions. Groups are always sort of fighting over each other, sometimes in a friendly manner, sometimes not so friendly. I think in any other city, in any other one of these major mobilizations, and we've seen it, it's empirically there, like when those houses got raided, or the Convergence Center got raided, and it was those anarchists who were planning these awful things, which turns out to be nothing, but, it sounded mighty scary at the time, and they put on this press conference with all these, inner tubes that were going to be used as weapons and and all this stuff. Look what they found, and these people are trying to shut down your right to protest. They're trying to disrupt your protest. They're trying to interfere with your free speech. In any other city, we would have had at least half of the organizers immediately come out and say, yes, that's those anarchists. Yeah, we weren't planning on doing anything like that. We're peaceful. Yeah, we don't want anything to do with them. That's them. Don't come after us because we're the peaceful ones. We're the good protesters. And they would have been pushed off to the side and vilified by a lot of the leaders. And that did not happen here. Not one bit. Due to the preparation that started with, as I mentioned, I was at that first meeting, and the first thing we talked about is how do we avoid the problems we've seen in the past? How do we avoid those divisions? But more often, it was mostly approached from a positive standpoint of how do we work together?
Take one